Welcome to the planning board meeting of January 6th? 7th. Steve is ill today, so I am on the gavel. Hooray. I have a couple of quick planning board business and policies notes to get through. The big item on the agenda, which we'll get to when we get there, is the 60 West Main Street special permit public hearing, which the applicant is requesting a continuance. So that will not be the focus of our meeting today. Will likely be the discussion on the marijuana bylaw, and we have people here to talk about that. So to kind of get things rolling with business and policies, everything there, but Paul, you do have one bill that you wanted to pass around, which is from the Sun Chronicle.
Right.
And that is for a few different amendments.
Right.
And
So I should point out, two of them were items, these are all for noticing requirements in the Sun Chronicle. Two of them were for items that you've seen. Normally, we always require that the applicants make out the bills for the Sun Chronicle to the Sun Chronicle, but in this case, these two were made out to us, so we're depositing it and we're just paying it, and the other is one that we incurred for the notices prior to the town meeting, the items that we brought forward.
so I'll let that get passed around so everybody can take a look at, since there's a few of them there, so it's 10 pages, that's 8 pages or so. Go ahead, Joe.
The ones that were made out to, the check was made out to us, is the accounting office okay with, because typically if it's made out to the town of Norton, it goes in the general fund and not into our account, so.
Yeah, you'll see, there's actually backup material that we provided to them, so the accounting office, we were working with them and they were fine with it.
In other words, they'll credit our account for the amount of the check?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Fine.
As that gets passed around, we do have minutes from our December 17th meeting. I'm not sure if everybody had a chance to look at them prior to the meeting, because I know the agenda was posted on time, but it didn't go out to us at the same time. So if anybody has had a chance to review, if we want to, if we would be more comfortable postponing that until a later meeting.
I would request doing that. I haven't had a chance to look at it.
Okay. So I think we'll hold off on approving these minutes until the next meeting, Paul, if that
Okay.
makes sense. So as soon as that bill goes around, we'll be able to approve that. But in terms of the, do you have any additional questions about the bill or the reimbursement, how that's going to work, since Paul's been ironing all that out with the accounting office?
Down here.
Once Kevin gets a chance to see that, I'll entertain a motion to approve that.
So moved.
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Passes. For the public hearings for special permit 486 and 491, so we'll have to,
Did you sign too? Or do you want to?
no, I have not signed. I'll do that at the end.
Okay.
Have to open those, and then we'll continue them at the applicant's request to the 28th. Does anybody have any questions about that, or?
I just have a question in general, not specifically, but when we get something like this, is it possible that you can generate some kind of notice to us of when something gets posted, so we know it's continued? I mean, I know I was trying to prepare and review notes for a meeting on this topic, and I only found out that it was going to be continued by having to look at it at the last minute, just to type something out.
We had a communication error over submitting it. We should have sent that out with our notice, with a notice last week, an update to you all, and that didn't happen, because we would have put in there that there was.
And the other thing, is there some way we can notify abutters that something like this is going on? I mean, in this case, there's only one.
Continuation?
Huh?
A continuation?
It was posted
Continuation?
this
You
way.
post it.
Yeah.
You post it with a continuance. There were,
The agenda was posted as is in
Right.
front of you, saying that it was a continuance, so when the applicant saw it, the butters saw it, they would know.
Second.
The reason for the continuance is that the applicant is still doing some of their testing, because they had trouble getting people to complete the work over the holidays, so. So, if we're continuing these to the 28th, entertain a motion to that effect,
So moved.
Second.
and all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And that is continued. So moving on to our discussion on the marijuana bylaw industrial development commission. I know Renee has some material prepped up on her computer to show us, and I think everybody has a handout in front of them as well, which runs through the draft. Apparently it is not hooking up, but.
It usually
Okay.
does it when I disconnect it.
just let me, I
Okay.
switched it.
Going.
While he's figuring that out, thank you guys for having us tonight. So I am here on behalf of the Industrial Development Commission. I'm the chair of that commission. We're going to have Denise Luciano join us too. She had to take care of a personal issue, but she'll be here. She's the vice chair. And then Sandy is on the IDC as well. Sandy's actually an alternate, but she is our SERPED representative. So her inputs and just her knowledge too in respect to zoning and the the website. She's my like midnight call to say, how do I do this? to figure out the navigation there. So what we wanted to do is just have a conversation with you about the approach and some of the changes. There's Denise, just in time. Hello. Here, sit on here. About the approach and some of the changes that we were looking at in respect to the marijuana bylaw. So from an IDC perspective, we've been talking about it for the better part of this year. We were hoping to take action on it earlier, but when we actually started digging into it and looking at some of the other bylaws around Massachusetts, we realized it was a little bit bigger than we thought. So Denise will be the first person to tell you that I think we've rewritten this. I think we're on our third or fourth complete
At least-
restart.
Yeah, third restart
Right.
from scratch, yeah.
So there's a lot of work that the group's been doing, and we're hoping with your partnership and guidance and input that we can get this to the finish line. We are going to, I'll talk about a little bit here.
We can switch to this if you need to. I don't know why. This should be on HDMI 2.
Yeah, it happens to us every now and then too, and then sometimes it just, do you want to put up the presentation?
Yeah.
It's up to you. I don't know if it'll be easier to see up there or easier here.
Paul,
What
if
was
you
that,
have it,
Shane?
we may as well
Yeah.
Oh, I
do
think so.
that to reinforce at the minimum for anybody watching,
Right.
Oh.
so.
Okay. So the version that you have, it is a draft version. This is something, parts of this we've talked about in the IDC. We haven't officially voted on this, but the presentation that we're going to talk from today is something that we're planning on leveraging throughout this process. So a lot of it is, information that we've gathered during our meetings. A lot of it is research that we've done online from talking to people. So hopefully, and please stop me as I go through this if you have questions. And, if it's something that we don't know the answer to, we'll certainly get back with you guys to do that. But, honestly, like I said, this is a discussion. We want to figure out how can we actually get this to the finish line in the town. Oh, you have it. Okay. You want to be the maestro? Sure. Okay. Let me shut this one down because I'll get all confused.
It's a huge laptop.
That's a nice one.
It's wide.
Do you have the bylaw on here too, the draft bylaw? Okay.
No, I don't.
I think we've got copies of that one.
Yeah, is it colored? Is it in color?
No.
No, you can
You can
see
see
the red
highlighting
lines.
though and strikeouts.
Okay. I'll keep it up on my, I can always save it on my stick and put it in there too. We'll talk about that towards the end. So, in respect to the things we want to talk about, so a little bit about the opportunities that we think that this will bring to the town, the current state of the industry in Massachusetts, the current state within Norton, as well as the potential business opportunities that we've already seen. So we've had several potential applicants come to IDC meetings. I had the pleasure of attending the cannabis convention last year, and I met a lot of contacts. So I'm still getting contacted, other selectmen are getting contacted, and the town manager and Paul as well. So collectively, we've been having meetings with different folks. And really, from our perspective, while, we see us being liaisons with them, once we figure out the bylaws and get things rolling, it's been an investigative effort, I think, for us to really understand what are their requirements, what things in Norton present challenges to them, what things do we need to consider from a perspective of making sure that, I don't want to say protect the town, but that we do the right thing for the town. So they've been really good discussions. And then we'll talk about just what we see as the future state of the bylaws and the zoning proposal, and then a little bit about the timeline. And of course, just to put it out there, like I said, we are targeting for the May town meeting. We understand that there's a lot of work to do. I think we've done a lot now. But, as conversations go, input, from you guys and others too, we expect that we'll be kind of navigating that timeline throughout. So if we just want to go to the opportunities page, and I'm sorry I don't have page numbers on here. Good job. So one of the things, we passed 2 articles in 2018 that we haven't taken any action on. So the first one was in respect to 3% excise tax for all of marijuana retail sales. And then the other one was the having marijuana establishments in the industrial zone districts. We haven't, we put it on there, it passed at town meeting, and we've really done nothing. So we have had folks come. There have been some questions, and we'll talk about a little bit later on with the existing bylaws that are there, and I think that's kind of why it's been in limbo up to this point. But we really want to look at this industry. I mean, we see it, people pop, I don't want to say people popping up everywhere, but I mean, even in Mansfield, they just passed or approved a retail dispensary there. I think it's a good opportunity. I feel like, and we've talked about this a bit on the IDC, like we're slightly behind, where we want to be. I think that eventually this is going to be a complete non-issue because it's going to be like a liquor store, right? They're everywhere you can go, and it's not going to be a big deal. One of the things that we're hoping to do, and through the conversations that we've had, is not specifically just focus on retail, but focus on some of the other opportunities that we'll present here in a bit later. The one thing, it's all about, I don't want to say it's all about the revenue, but we're looking at what we've done with our, with the bylaw, with how the town has voted, with some of the discussion at that town meeting a couple years ago. What year are we in? 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It feels like it was not that long ago.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that in doing this, while we are looking at, increasing the tax base, generating more revenue for the town, we want to make sure that we do stay within the town's character. So that's been a big discussion for us, and we'll have some specific questions of you guys later in respect to thoughts that we need to focus on for the zoning. The other opportunity too is the host community agreement. So the HCA allows collaboration between the companies coming in and the municipality. There's some additional, I don't want to call it revenue, but there's a community impact fee that's there, and that money goes directly back into the community, and it supports things like law enforcement, programs on public health and safety. So it's a really good opportunity for us to be able to provide more programs in the town. The one thing with the HCA, and I don't think it's on here, the HCA's, they're only good for 5 years. So there's been a lot of controversy, a lot of articles that have been out at, they're extortion, people are asking for more, and people are. There are specific guidelines that the state has in respect to what you can include in the host community agreement. The Board of Selectmen have been reviewing the HCA. We actually just got a a copy back today from council with some updates that includes more than just retail, because we were focused just on a retail dispensary. So those things are already in process too. But, you know, a lot of good work there, and I think that the Cannabis Control Commission did a really good job of focusing on what are some things that, you know, we can, I don't want to say mitigate, but a lot of this, it's about the impact to the community. You know, is it going to be traffic? Could it be other issues like that? So it gives us an opportunity to have partnerships there and actually bring programs to people. And, you know, we think about it a lot with, especially the opioid crisis right now. You know, if we can bring something in here about substance abuse and get training out there, I think it's a good thing to do. And there's some other conditions in there too. They're in the HCA. It varies depending upon, you know, what the agreement is, but I can provide some of those to you once we get closer to, if you're interested, once we get closer to a final stage of being comfortable with how the host community agreement is written. So if we talk a little bit about the state of the cannabis industry now. On the left side of this, there's just a brief timeline of what Massachusetts did, right? Back in 2008, it started with the decriminalization of the possession of small amounts of marijuana, and then it moved to legalizing medical marijuana and then legalizing recreational marijuana. And then in November of 2018, the first 2 recreational retail dispensaries opened. I noted here the first week of sales, it was $2.2 million. That excludes one day. It was actually over Thanksgiving, but those 2 establishments generated quite a bit of revenue in that short period of time. So again, looking at, you know, where are we in the mix of benefiting from the potential revenue, I think this is a good example of how, you know, some folks already implemented this and are reaping the benefits. At the end of 2018 is when the CCC assumed administration of the industry. The difference here is that the Department of Public Health? Department of Public Health still oversees the registered medical marijuana dispensaries, so those are separate, but the adult use is regulated by the CCC. So in respect to the Cannabis Control Commission, they have one of the documentation, or one of the reference documents that we provided was the actual regulation from the CCC, as well as, I believe there are 2 guidance documents, one on guidance document for municipalities, and then one for, let me look at some municipalities and something else. Sorry, it's not coming to me right now. The Municipal Equity Guidance document. So those are 2 documents that we've used in our discussions in the IDC to figure out what guidelines are they providing to us, how we should think about things. We referenced them in respect to the hours of operation. We referenced them, a couple things they talked about were some licensing was in there.
Security pieces.
Yeah. A lot around security.
Yeah. I don't think what other pieces we pulled from there. Just licensing requirements and stuff like that, yeah.
But it's, I provided it just so you guys didn't have to go, you know, if you wanted to do some research, you didn't have to go out online and try to find all this stuff yourself. But they did a really good job of putting this together and giving some guidance to municipalities, especially when you haven't seen it before. We've leveraged a lot of, you know, other towns too, looking at their bylaws. What we tried to do is provide here those who looked at an overlay, or those who did something that wasn't specifically, you know, just, let's just put it in industrial and that's it. Because we wanted to provide some options back to the town. We initially, looking at this, Denise did a lot of work with the Mansfield bylaw.
Yeah.
And we thought that it was a really good one, and then when we got down to it, it just,
I think people find it a little bit confusing.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you'll see, and we'll talk about like more in the process when we get to that point about kind of how our discussion turned. And as I said, I mean, we're not lying when we literally started over again the 3rd time last week.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's one of those things that we want to make sure we do it right. We don't want to rush it and just put something out there to, you know, be able to attract new business. A couple other things that I put on here were just in respect to the state and the revenue that was generated for the first 2 months, based on $24 million in sales. I'm sorry, my nose is running, I'm just trying to find a tissue. Yeah, I'm not gonna find a tissue. And then just a note here in respect to the nearby facility. So I'm sure that most of you know, and I mentioned about Mansfield approving the retail dispensary. So that was just approved over the summer. It's going on, is that School Street there? By the Buffalo Wild Wings and White's Bakery. It's going in that plaza. We had some conversation, actually, one of the gentlemen from one of the potential applicants, he is the head of the security group. And he has actually been doing their transportation or their traffic plan as well and helping them with their security plan. So it was pretty interesting, like the conversation and really like the detail that they're talking about to make sure that, you know, there's not this overwhelming impact in the community at the time. I still find, especially in that area, I mean, that area is, I think, pretty heavy from the traffic perspective anyway. So I think it's going to be interesting when that shop opens up to really see how they're going to do this. But they've looked at everything from parking to the traffic flow to police details. And that's one of the things that the HCA talks about too, in respect to who pays for police details, when would you need it, considering, you know, whether or not you do things by appointment only, like those things that provide some flexibility if we start to see any sort of impact in the town. Thank you so much.
It's not slow.
That's okay. Later on, I'll have a red nose. And then the other thing on here too is Franklin. I don't know if you guys are aware that Franklin has actually a grow facility. So they do cultivation and they do manufacturing from one of their facilities. They had an expansion. I can't remember when the expansion was, maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago. I think it went from like 70,000 to 90,000 square feet. But again, something that, you know, it's not like it's a retail dispensary. You know, people aren't going to it. When we've talked to applicants about this, they're like, you know what, we want to be off the beaten path. Nobody needs to know we're there. So these are some potential opportunities that we could take advantage of that wouldn't, you know, have that have the traffic impact as a dispensary. They also just approved a dispensary as well in September. I couldn't find any information online though when that was going to open, but that was a big step for them, and they did had a lot of discussion to make sure it was the right thing to do. The final note on here is the Cannabis Control Commission I want to say in December, actually updated the regulations, and they included language now for marijuana delivery and social consumption. It's an interesting area. When they started to talk about it back in September, or maybe even before September, a lot of it was around, you know, we need to make sure we have the right legislation in place. How will we actually regulate social consumption? So I recommend, if you read nothing else in the document from the regulatory or the regulations perspective, jump down to the social consumption, because it's an interesting read in respect to making sure that people understand like the delay of any sort of effects from ingestion or whatever it might be. Any questions on this? You don't have to have questions. I just wanted to.
I have one in general. I don't know if you
Sure.
covered in here. I mean, you talk about licensing and a few other conditions. Is there any controls around the testing requirements for like different contaminations and pesticides? I know California has a big requirement around that. Does the state of Massachusetts mandate like the actual content of cannabis and marijuana?
So I haven't seen anything in respect to that. We talked to one person who was a grower, but he was completely organic. And he's the only one, too, that really considered outdoor growing. So I don't know if the requirements are different when you're looking at indoor facilities. Like the Franklin one was indoor, and I think most of the ones, I put a link in the reference in this PowerPoint where you can go up and see all the licenses that are issued right now. And I don't remember seeing any outdoor facilities, so I don't know if that changes.
Yeah, because in the end, it's a
Requirements.
chemical, right? So it's a chemical composition like Advil, anything else. So there's
Yeah.
some kind of a concentration depending on how you grow it and what kind of things you
In
use.
general, it's marketed from similarly to alcohol in like the ABV content of beer.
But it's one of the biggest things in the industry now is they don't really know how they want to regulate that by state. So I was just curious how the state of Massachusetts has chosen to do it, and then how do the different towns adopt it or not?
I know that I think it was the Dighton overlay district that talked about an applicant needing to report on the quality, I think they called it the quality of the product they're selling. And I think by that point, they're referring to the chemical composition, the potency, that sort of thing. So
I just didn't know
I
where
saw
that,
it
my
in,
question was around, where does that requirement to provide it and what kind of regulatory testing is necessary? Is it handled by the town? Is it handled by the state?
I know the state has a lot of requirements around testing. I'm not the.
And labeling.
I can certainly look it up and get back to you.
They
I
have-
mean, we focused a lot more
It
on.
would just be good to look at that, not just the licensing piece.
No, I agree.
'Cause the licensing piece is making it available for people to buy and regulate the different kind of use. But in the end, it's like, what's the deliverable? What's the composition of your deliverable?
A lot of it probably also falls under the state's labeling guidelines. 'Cause I know those are fairly extensive, right?
That
don't know, I'm
industry
gonna
is most
ask.
highly regulated by the Triple C right now. So they do differentiate between cannabis and hemp and the chemical composition between them. So
Yeah, and I seem
very
to,
highly regulated.
As long as we're correlated to what the regulation is. I mean, I work for an organization that develops equipment that tests this thing, and I know for us, it's a very challenging environment to understand what actually is being applied where. So we should just make sure we've evaluated to the exhaustive level to understand exactly what we're going to apply to these facilities.
I seem to recall that question coming up with one of the retailers that came to present to us. I remember them saying it was highly regulated. I don't know that we asked the question further of
It should be deeper.
where exactly is it regulated, but I'm sure it's in the CCC.
So Katie Law from KP Law has been working with the Triple C since inception. So we have access to her through KP, so that's something we can send an email to her.
Yeah.
And find out very easily.
She's the one that just sent back the HCA, so she's been working on our agreement. And she put in specifically for the manufacturing and the production, because we didn't have that in there. I think I mentioned that we only had the retail, so
Okay.
we can certainly, any questions that come up, we'll make sure that we'll get some
Great.
answers to.
Thank you.
Are there any excise taxes or impact fees connected with growth facilities?
So when I was at the cannabis convention, I was in a session with an attorney, and he said a couple of interesting things. He said, you know, like a red flag is if you go to a town and their zoning is only industrial, they don't want you there, right? The other red flag is that if they're looking to put an excise tax at 3% on any sort of a facility, a grow facility, or manufacturing or transport, that they're not serious about having you in town too. So I asked the question, like, well, what would be reasonable? Because you can, you know, you can have up to 3%. And he said, you know, nothing above 1%. So it's an option. It's something for us to consider if we wanted to. The one thing I don't know, and we'd have to ask the town council, is that another item that we'd have to vote at town meeting to implement an excise tax? Because I think Article 17, I think that was the first one, I think it's specific to retail dispensaries.
The
Do you remember?
3% is retail. It's for retail sales, I
Okay,
believe.
we didn't put marijuana establishments?
I'd have to look. I'm not
Okay.
sure.
You know, a lot of these facilities are also very vertically integrated, so a lot of them are growing their own stuff and then selling it on a retail basis. So you don't want to, it kind of turns into almost a capital gains kind of scenario, but you're kind of hitting them twice, essentially.
Yeah, we've only spoken to
yeah.
one applicant who they grow their own.
It's
all
it's
the
the
other-
case in a lot of
Yeah.
the industry.
A lot of them are just, they want to keep that with somebody else who's an expert at it. Let me just write this down so we can look it up.
Yeah, there's been a significant amount of M&A in the industry, and a lot of the retailers are buying grow facilities so they can sell their own and control what's being grown and what they're selling. So how that breaks down into the community host agreement and the excise taxes and all that jazz would be complicated.
Well, I mean, each agreement, the HCA that town council provides is a template.
Yeah.
Right? So each agreement, it can be different. So if there's somebody who, we have talked to an applicant, as I mentioned, they don't want to have a growth facility here. They have one already. They just want to have a retail dispensary. But if that came up, I don't think that we would go after 4% or 5% for, one company. I mean, I think we need to be reasonable in the approach. And certainly, as I mentioned, like the HCA's have been very controversial and towns like requiring donations that are way above and beyond what they should be, like in the tens of thousands, versus a couple of towns, I can't remember, I was reading an article today where there was a town that had the 3% excise tax, the 3% community impact fee, and then they had 2 or 3 donations of like $2,500 to like the Boys and Girls Club, like different organizations within their community. So I think more reasonable than some of the others who, have said, oh, you have to buy, like, I think the article was around a ladder truck for the fire department that they were trying to get a cannabis company to purchase for them. So I think those are the things that town council will be very specific on if, we're overstepping our reach.
Has the work you've done given you any indication about the parking requirements or the traffic generation from these facilities?
So it does require that they all have traffic studies. There are some parking specifics in there. I don't know, do you remember?
I don't know off the top of my head what they were, but there were some parking requirements that were in there.
Yeah. I think the big thing is in talking to these companies, like if they come to you, like one of them specifically, it was all about the security, it was about the parking, the traffic, like what's the impact going to be to the community. I think you can kind of gauge like how the partnerships would go and those who are really fluent in this information. And that's something I think we need to understand too, like one of the questions we'll have about zoning, depending upon what our zoning is, right, we may not have in a particular district the ability to have a retail shop because we wouldn't be able to provide ample parking.
Well, in some of the conferences I've gone to where there were other planning board members, one of the main concerns was dealing with the traffic. To the point where people had to make reservations to come pick up their stuff, which is something at a different scale. You said you've had a couple of people approaching your committee for opportunities. Do you have an idea what parts of towns they're looking at this point? Any
Yeah,
specific part?
can I table that for right now?
Okay.
And then we'll touch on it when we get to the end.
Okay.
Because they are, a lot of them are pretty specific, and I think it really actually helps us as a community and some of the requirements.
Okay.
Renee, I have
Yes.
one question while we're on this slide. So obviously, when the first 2, retail dispensaries open, booming right out of the gate, is there anything published that shows did they kind of steady out? At what level? Did they kind of steady out from sales? Like, because I'm sure, first 2, boom, skyrocketed. It hasn't plummeted, I'm going to guess, to, the depths. Like, did they find, like, happy medium? Is there some place where you'd say, okay, this is where they leveled out from a sales perspective?
Well, I think it's leveling out from 2 things. One, because it's not new anymore, but
Right.
also because there are so many opening.
Yeah.
So you don't have people traveling
To these
from
two.
all over, right, to
Yeah.
these 2 places. So it was interesting because Chief Clark came to one of our meetings. He provided some input into the HCA as well, and he actually talked to the police chief of, what was the first, I always want to say.
Northampton?
No, what's the other one? It's not Leominster.
Lester?
Yes.
It's on the screen.
Yes. Oh, is it? I can't see. But he talked to the police chief, and one of the things he said is that a lot of what they anticipated to be problems weren't problems. But he did say in the beginning they had a lot of traffic concerns. And that's been our discussion with everybody that's come forward on how are you going to mitigate this? Like, we want to understand that plan beforehand and that they're going to be serious about it. And I think that's really going to be your role when we're looking at permitting and such.
So kind of that, so the one that is coming in Mansfield, that's obviously close by. I think is there another one in Attleboro or South Attleboro?
And they're,
Lakeville.
There's one in Lakeville that's opening up, there's one in Lakeville that's getting permitted right now.
Okay.
So they're growing in every town.
Okay, I was just curious, like, kind of
They're-
what
they're all
our
over.
surrounding towns, like, what type of, what they had, I guess, kind of explored to this point, so they're kind of popping up everywhere, it sounds like. Okay.
yeah, and there's a section within the, I don't know if it's in the guidance document or within the regulations that specifically talks about police details and the traffic and traffic management.
Interesting.
Any other questions before we move? Okay. The next slide is, we'll just look at it quickly. This is just showing the number of approved licenses by county. I just want to mention on here, I had the November slide in here, and I just got the December one. And in Bristol County specifically, it went from 19 to 21 just in a 3-month period. I'm assuming, actually, I'm sorry, a 1-month period because they're generating these in the month. So it's certainly something on On here, I didn't look to see if they had a division between what was retail versus a production or cultivation or transport, but I imagine that information is probably out there too, but this is updated once a month, so I wish I saved the November one before I overrode it with the December, just to kind of track to see, you know, how quickly it's coming across the state. Okay, so on the next section, it's the state of our bylaws in Norton. So we have, Paul and I have talked about this initially as we were reading this, and we've had a lot of conversation in the IDC about this. So currently we have an article for registered medical marijuana dispensaries. It's very specific. The terminology, when this was, I don't remember when it was actually approved, but I remember reading through the materials. Like, it's, from a layperson perspective, I think it's a pretty difficult read.
Yeah, and it's specific to just the prescription ones, yeah.
It is, yep. So within that, there's a specific statute that you have to have a 1,000-foot buffer from any other zone district. And it gives requirements on how you measure that, as you guys, I don't know if any of you guys were on the board when this was approved. You were, Joe? Do you remember a lot of the detail around that?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember a lot of the detail around the 1,000-foot buffer?
No, I think the concern was they wanted, or we wanted, a 1,000-foot buffer from residential. And that seemed to be the cleanest way of doing it. You know, 1,000 feet from any other zoning district, whether it's residential, village, commercial, or the like. But that was the rationale behind that.
Right. And so now with that, I mean, most people come here and there's one area that really meets those requirements. And we'll talk a little bit more about the, you know, what the commission actually recommends. But so we have one specifically for medical marijuana dispensaries, and then what we passed in 2018 was marijuana establishment. So we provide the definition for what a marijuana establishment was, and then we listed within, we approved within the industrial district. It's 2 items within the uses. One says, you know, site consumption, and one says no site consumption. But they're specific in how they're defined, and then also having a special permit required and a site plan approval. So that's what's in place right now. The one thing that could be argued and can really provide an issue for the town is that the only place that we put a buffer was within the medical marijuana dispensary guidelines. So we put the 1,000-foot there. So essentially, the way that we have our bylaws written, somebody could come in right now and plop down industrial, and you can have a house right next to you, and that's zoned residential, because the guideline is only in the RMD. So we didn't apply that to the adult recreational use. Additionally, too, the CCC talks a lot about the only requirement that they have, and it's a requirement not that we would have to follow. We can certainly have it shorter if we wanted, but the 500-foot buffer around any schools K through 12. There are towns, we looked at some bylaws where we saw 250, we saw 300 feet.
Yep, 300 feet I remember seeing most recently, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things, like I noted on here too, is that, you know, that last sentence there, they talk about that the additional buffer zones or separation requirements, they might not be necessary, and certainly we might have some legality issues too. So if, you know, I don't know, we'd have to talk to town council about this, like, are we in violation having this 1,000-foot buffer in our existing?
I think we were advised just not to touch the buffer in the adult use when we approved that bylaw. That's my kind of, the state lays out its buffer. In a perfect world, we should make these match up.
Right.
But because of how the CCC's guidelines are written, town council felt that we, as it says here, kind of weren't sure if we were able to do that, so we didn't.
Right, which, I mean, I think that's been kind of one of, you know, our perspectives of the state's regulating it. If we could use the state requirement and we feel it's adequate for the town, it's certainly, you know, I don't want to say easier for us, but a good way just to reference that, no matter how it's written in that,
Right.
in our
My number
bylaw.
of reference.
Did you have a question, Orin?
No, you've noted here, the commission suggests that additional buffer zones or separations may not be necessary and cautions community against acting arbitrarily. Okay. But it doesn't prohibit it, just says, don't be arbitrary about.
Well, if you read the sentence before it, it talks about whether or not those buffer zones, around other uses are permissible, or legally permissible. So in some of actually in our RMD one, right, we put in there, daycare centers, churches, playgrounds,
I was gonna say churches and playgrounds were in there too, yeah.
areas where children congregate. Like, we have all these additional things that the CCC and the state do not list, right? So is it legal? I don't know. That's, not a conversation that we've had with town council. But certainly, I think we're trying to address that regardless with, some updates in the bylaws overall.
Have you come across specific overlay districts to create this? And
Yes.
Is that what some of these towns are doing?
Yes.
And can they identify an overlay district for this particular purpose, or does it have to be more general?
They've done it for just a specific purpose.
Okay, so that can really accommodate some of those concerns rather than having to put these limitations. If you create your own district within certain bounds, you can probably cover the same thing. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll
think
talk, Denise will, go ahead,
I
sorry.
was gonna say, I think that's been our goal in terms of coming up with the overlay, is to kind of let the map speak for itself in terms of, where do we want it, what do we want to keep it away from, and in the map, we can show all that with the overlay district, so.
And Denise is really good about telling us when we should and shouldn't do something.
Sometimes.
Well, I'm not saying we always listen, but I'm saying you're good at telling us, because if you're really specific in the bylaw, but then you have this overlay and you're looking at it and they're out of sync, then.
Right, that's a problem.
Yeah, and then it's a problem, somebody comes in front of you and now all of a sudden you have this, arbitrary information, you don't know what type of a decision to make.
But on the, if that's allowed, that becomes, from my perspective, a lot more useful in that you're really identifying your concerns up front. And once you do that, you don't have to have a general district and try to modulate the distances that would apply for various purposes. So-
Right,
And
right.
that's where I could see you getting into trouble, could be you're being arbitrary. But if you have that district and the town can finally map out where it likes to see these things go, and it understands the impact of that makes a lot of sense for me.
Well, not to skip ahead, if in fact I am, but on your proposed draft, you have asterisks for the special permit, and you make, that asterisk refers to adult use marijuana consumption overlay. But I don't see the overlay anywhere.
Wait, so we're not that far in the process
Okay,
yet?
so just so that I understand, you are contemplating
Yes.
Yes.
that there be an overlay that would further restrict commercial industrial? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we had a 4-hour meeting last week, and the purpose of that meeting was specifically to come up with some sort of visual, and I think we had a lot of good discussion, but it brought up a lot of questions of, okay, let's really think about this, and then we have a meeting tomorrow, and hopefully with your feedback, that'll kind of help guide us.
I'm bringing the crayons.
Yes.
A lot of different colored Sharpies.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it really is. And so, actually, if we move ahead, I'll tell you why we've struggled with this. So when we look at some of the different business opportunities that we can have, right? So you think about this. We've had some interesting business concepts come in front of us, and so. Again, it's easy when you think about the retail, because you're like, okay, well, we don't want that traffic to impact like the center of town. We don't want it going by our schools or doing whatever. But then when you start talking about like cultivation or growing or distribution, then it's different, right? Because it doesn't have that high volume traffic. And then you look at our zoning, and we don't have, I think Paul was the first one to say when we had, when you finally had it sitting in front of you and digitally, like how crazy our zoning is. And, one of the reasons why that 1,000-foot buffer, it's almost impossible to have that in town. So this is how the discussion, we really focused on what are the different establishments. We haven't heard from folks in every area. You'll see the far right column talks about the interest. So for a cannabis cultivation or marijuana, I wasn't sure, we have both of these definitions in there, so I put both down. But a marijuana cultivator, somebody who actually is licensed to grow and they can process it. We did have somebody who came in to talk about that. This was somebody also who falls into the social consumption. And, as I mentioned, the interesting concept, he's looking for like a farm to table, organic, like growing about an acre, and then having a
Little
bed and breakfast the bed and breakfast, so it's farm to table, you come, and like, we talked extensively about, you know, how do you transport people around town? Like, now you're going to one of his business partners is a chef, and so they've done a lot with, cooking with marijuana and CBD.
Yeah, and his concept was you wouldn't have to worry about people consuming and then driving, because they'd be consuming and then spend the night there. And then if there were people in town that wanted to go to the establishment, then he would have some kind of a mini bus or something that would pick them up, bring them
Right.
to the establishment. That was his vision, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is the growth facilities, does that fall into our agricultural uses, or do they separate that out for some of, is that identified other than agricultural use?
You know what, I read that today, and I want to say it's separated out, but I'm going to come back to you unless you know right offhand.
I don't.
It's in the chart here, actually, for the cannabis cultivation. It says
Oh, maybe this is where I read it.
manufacturing use and is not agriculturally exempt from zoning.
So it's
It's
not.
not agricultural.
This must be where I read it, because I was looking at it.
negative in there.
It's not.
Not exempt.
It's
Right.
not exempt from,
Right.
it's
Because
not
this-
agriculturally exempt. from-
So it can't get an agricultural exception to
Right,
anything.
so Dover wouldn't apply.
Okay.
But it, as Chris was mentioning, hemp is regulated by the Department of Agriculture. They set the threshold by what's defined as hemp. And anything above that would be under the Cannabis Control Commission. So it's not agriculture
Okay,
that reviewed. I don't know if agriculture has a role in it, but
so you'd almost have to create a separate use for growth facilities. They wouldn't fall under farming or agriculture under our current zoning.
right, state law prohibits that.
So, and we do have, is it, Chris, I don't know if you know this, if it comes through your office, a hemp license? Is it called a
There's no
hemp license?
license, it's a right to grow. Our agriculture is free, and we can't regulate it, and they can't even tell us where they're gonna be. So they get licensed by the state, they come in, and they can just,
They tell us they're here, that's all they're,
that's it.
They tell us they're here, but they tell us we can't tell you where, but they have to put a sign out.
right. I read that
It's-
when it came through my email, I'm like, this makes no sense to
I'm
me.
sorry, that's for what?
Hemp.
For hemp.
That's for hemp?
For hemp.
Oh.
So it's not something that comes in front of anyone.
Because it's
in town.
regulated as agriculture, is that why?
It's not regulated.
Right to grow.
Like, we can't regulate it. Agriculture is like child care, it's not allowed, right? It's a Doberman kind of thing.
But the Department of Agriculture,
Regulate.
as the state, regulates it, but the town can't
Gotcha.
on hemp.
Makes perfect sense.
I have no idea what the difference is between hemp and marijuana, why the requirements would
Still-
be different.
It's the, yeah, the
That's it?
THC,
The
which is,
effects?
High content from marijuana.
yeah, that's the chemical that gets you high. And so I don't know what the threshold is, but you're below it, you're considered hemp. If you're above it, then it's marijuana.
And it's used for ropes and other stuff.
I was gonna say, I've only known it to be used for like bracelets and stuff, so is it consumed the same way? No.
Can't say I'm an expert, so.
I'm already learning a lot tonight.
Let's televise, what did you say?
Renee, just the interest level here, is that a number or is that a rating scale? or-
That's the number of potential applicants.
Okay.
So we had 3 different companies talk about a retail
And
dispensary.
then one transporter.
Yes, yeah. And the transporter is actually interesting because it's an existing company, well, they're existing business partners in town, but the company that they work for would not be associated with that. But they have, they're distributors, so they have that,
Background.
yeah, that background, that knowledge.
Okay.
And I've probably had conversations with about 5 more companies
Yeah.
before I knew you all were really focusing in on it. So
And would you say they were more retail-based or a variety?
I think a variety, but it's a mix between retail and grow. And then, of course, there's the one for you have it for transporter,
Yeah, it's
What?
called, they call it transport.
right?
Transporter now. I have three folks who are interested in doing a grow facility, like on a smaller scale. Like I think the one gentleman, if I remember, talked about like maybe 5,000 square feet, but with the ability to build later on. He has a, I don't want to call it a store, but an operation in Framingham, and so he's looking to move a little bit further across the state. So there are more people. We just haven't had time. We typically just have one one potential applicant come in front of us to talk about, their business and why they're looking at Norton and what we could do to help. But I imagine that, as we continue this process, like, I'd really like to hear from somebody specifically, like, on the processing side of it or the manufacturing side, because we haven't talked to anybody about that. And that brings, like, a lot of things that I've read in respect to the manufacturing is, you could have some issues with smell in the area, how do they mitigate that? So those are some things that I'd like to know beforehand. It's been a huge, like, learning experience. Like, they come in and they talk about things that we'd never consider. Whether it's because it's in, the CCC or because of their experience. So it's been good discussion. But these are a couple of the different types of marijuana establishments that we can have. I pulled this specifically from the draft bylaw that you have. It's just so if you're wondering where the reference is. Okay, so the next section just talks about what's our future state. So if we can talk a little bit about the process, we don't want to do this in a vacuum. We want to make sure that there's collaboration across multiple boards. We are presenting to the joint meeting this Thursday with the Board of Selectmen School Committee and Finance Committee, having a very similar discussion, just to introduce it, get some initial thoughts, and then hopefully people will, be thinking about this and we'll get some questions that maybe we haven't thought of that we can consider now as opposed to, right before we're ready to bring this to town meeting. As I think Denise mentioned this, right, again, we're looking that where there are requirements already from the Cannabis Control Commission, that we utilize those, but we also have the autonomy to create additional restrictions or guidelines where necessary. So we're certainly cognizant of that. Our primary purpose here is to identify visually an overlay district. It would be in conjunction to what we already have outlined from the industrial district. But, again, us considering what's the town's character, where would we want to see this, where don't we want to see it. A lot of I gotta tell you that the online tool is great because, when you put in the 500-foot requirement, like it's a good visual. Like we have some industrial space on 123, or industrial zone area on 123, and it's so close to the schools that, it would never be useful for this purpose. So it's nice that like we actually have that visual to see that quickly. But the other things that, I want to mention two things here. We're still considering or would prefer to have the special permitting, the site plan approvals. I imagine that you guys probably would as well, so that we have a really deep look into this. The other thing too is, I mentioned the regulations right now, that they have the social consumption. They have an entire section on there. We're not looking to change our existing bylaw that talks about social consumption versus not having it, even though we have talked to an applicant that has a pretty cool business concept. We don't think right now that it's something that we're really ready for in the town. So now I'm not saying that if you guys had a different idea or others did, that we couldn't be convinced.
Right.
But it's not something that we're actively pursuing.
Remember correctly, the town council had the similar advice to stick with that. That was more of the standard across the state, not to have social consumption. Is that right, Joe?
I'm sorry?
Remember the conversation with town council? We talked a lot about social consumption, and she had advised to make sure we put that into our bylaw.
Yeah, I think there was concern amongst the board in terms of, this was all new at the time. Social consumption was probably the riskier of the two, and we were advised to just kind of
I think
feel our way along with the retail or whatever other aspect of it as opposed to social consumption.
Yeah, and you figure it took over a year for the CCC to actually come up with some legislation in respect to that, so.
Yeah.
It's new for them too. I mean, they'll probably have some changes based on the pilot program that they're doing.
Yeah, I think given the fact that, you made the analogy to a liquor store earlier, there is no, right now, like, test for impairedness with marijuana at this point, so I think it's challenging to regulate something where you don't have a way where it would be challenging to enforce, especially when it's not, when you get into adult use, you have a lot of people doing with like there's a delayed impact, so you have something and then an hour later it kicks in, and if you're driving, that's not good.
Right. And Chief Clark spoke about that too, and there was some sort of additional training, because I remember we talked about it at one of the Board of Selectmen meetings in respect to how can we leverage that in the host community agreement, so that our folks are trained in that regard, like as more information comes out. I can't remember it specifically, but
Yeah.
I can certainly bring it back to the group. Okay, if we move just to the timeline section, we can kind of talk more about the process, and I'll turn it over to Denise once we just kind of look at the timeline. We listed on here that in the beginning, you know, in May of 2018 is when we actually approved the 2 articles. Kept it on there just kind of a placeholder so we could see over the evolution of time. As I mentioned early on, the IDC, we've been talking about this for several months. We met with the first potential applicant in May, and then we've had 5 or 6 since then. So it's been something that we've talked about pretty much, I think, every meeting that we've had. We were kind of slow going on the meetings, so you'll see in the beginning of the year we didn't have as many as we have in the fourth quarter when we really kind of looked at what's in front of us and what do we need to do. So part of our plan in doing this, as I mentioned, collaboration is really big with us. We want to make sure that folks understand it, that any sort of changes or concerns are addressed early on. We're planning on not only meeting with some of the other boards, but also sitting down with the police chief and the fire chief to review the proposal as well, to get their input. I think some of the big dates, and I'm going to have to kind of change this a little different here, is the warrant article being due on February 12th. So we actually wrote language last September for the October meeting in respect to bylaw changes. So we have something that we can leverage for that. I shouldn't say we, I think Denise did that. I think you wrote that just to get it on the list.
Oh, to get it on the list, yeah.
Yeah. But that's, one of the dates that obviously we need to target. And then, understanding, we've had some conversation with Paul about what's the process moving forward from a perspective of public hearings that need to happen, making sure that town council has enough time to review and opine, and then having information sessions. And I think you said we're not required to have 2, we have to at least have 1. Did you say in your
Information
email
sessions.
today, the information sessions?
You're not required to do informational sessions, it's just a good practice
Oh, okay.
to do it. But what anyone who's making changes to the zoning bylaw has to come before the planning board so that they can make a recommendation to council. So tentatively, we're looking at the April meetings to be those meetings specifically for any of the zoning bylaw changes.
Okay. And we do have that on here. Paul had
Right.
indicated you have tentative dates of April 7th and 28th, and then May 5th. So once those are confirmed, you guys vote on it, we'll adjust as needed.
And the town manager has mentioned doing a pre-town meeting event so people who have warrants can meet with the public, and so we have to figure out that and add that to any of our timeframes here too. So that would be an opportunity, but you could
Yeah.
certainly host, we could certainly host informational sessions on the bylaw change. I know you're looking at March, April, so we could certainly get that apart from even if we do a pre-town meeting event.
Yeah. I think it would just be a good opportunity to make sure that, everybody feels that they have an opportunity to provide feedback and concerns, and it's okay. I can never figure out how to get mine to mute on everything. And then I listed, and I don't have the date, I have the date somewhere, but we put on here April, May 2020 for the Board of Selectmen, Planning Board, and the Finance Committee to review and vote on the warrant article. So that is, we have a meeting on Thursday, and we'll talk a little bit more with the groups on the timeline. While we have certain requirements, the Board of Selectmen are going to recommend that we have some additional meetings in there and get things, obviously, in order before we have in the past, so that everybody who should have the documentations from the moderator or the Finance Committee, that everybody's in sync and having some joint sessions with it. So it's just general April, May, because I don't know what those dates are going to be or what we're going to target. But so from a perspective of if we can talk a little bit about the bylaws. So the other document that, well, let me ask, does anybody have any questions or input on the timeline, anything that we should consider? Outside of your review, councils, working with some of the other boards?
I would just put a comment that, we'll have, we're initiating the bylaw changes as well for the Village Center District, so we'll try to work to time up these. Obviously, we'll have the public meetings in April, but there may be opportunities to collaborate and, but we just have to think about that we'll have a couple of amendments that are pretty substantial changes to the bylaw.
So a lot of zoning talk that night, that's basically what you're saying.
Lots of zoning talk. It'll be a fun
No
night.
Eddies on the floor.
Well, you will hear more Thursday about the game plan for this, but to not repeat what happened at the last town meeting, so
Understood.
this is a reaction to that.
Good idea. And this looks like it is maybe more complicated than what we had at the last town meeting. That was confusing, so.
Yeah, are you going to be reviewing this? Or-
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Renee, the submittal of the articles for the town warrant, you don't have to have the bylaw 100% completed by then, you just have to put a placeholder in.
Correct, for February 12th, yeah, just a placeholder. But what we would want to do on there is just list the articles that we expect to modify, or if we expect to add anything on there. I know when we drafted it last time, we weren't quite sure the direction that we were going to go, so we put in more than what we thought, because we're like, well, if we go this way, we have to do this. We were all inclusive, because we can modify that, but it's a little bit harder to get things in versus taking things out.
If you're going for an overlay district, don't you have to, wouldn't you need to identify that as part of the warrant? Because that's basically notifying people.
visual?
The visual, yeah.
Oh, yes, definitely.
That's a zoning change.
Yeah, but
So we
it
would have
can't
to-
be general. I mean, that may need to be specific, because that's the problem they ran into the last time, is they try to change industrial into commercial, and that wasn't in the warrant, and the moderator didn't feel that that was appropriate. So the same thing would probably hold true in terms of who is it affecting? And if
So-
nobody knows, they're really not giving notice of it.
So this will be important too, because where we have that overlay, we probably will need to put signs out on those properties too,
You mean like a butter notices?
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right, abutter notices and the signs.
What's,
Change the subject, that's a zoning amendment that we ought to make. Putting up signs is foolish.
Right.
Putting up signs is foolish, Joe?
In terms of placing signs on every property that is affected by zoning, a proposed zoning change, I think is foolish. And some of them are still up in town, and once they're up, I don't know who looks at them.
Yeah, driving by, it's a little hard to read.
Whether,
At
Well,
45 miles an hour, it's, don't-
along those same lines too, the bylaw says that we have to put the signs up 3 weeks before your first public
Right.
hearing versus 2 weeks for the notice in the paper and to the abutters. So
And I remember we struggled with that.
it caused some backup on
Right.
our end of
Yeah.
it too, that we had to push your meeting.
Right.
We had to push the meeting further, which put us
Right.
into that situation. We got
Exactly.
closer because
Yeah.
we couldn't meet the
We couldn't make it
3-week
3
rule.
weeks. Yep.
Right, so.
So from what you're saying, from a priority perspective, we need to focus on the visual zoning map and then the bylaws secondarily, right?
Based on how it's
So the-
written now to
because the visuals will
properly
serve as our
sign.
notice.
Well,
Yeah.
we're
It'll
we're
identify.
stuck
the
living with the
abutters.
sign bylaw.
Until we change it, Joe.
Until it's changed.
Yeah.
But, and I don't know, town council would probably give better advice certainly than I could, but whether the zoning map is a separate article altogether in terms of the establishment of the overlay, or if it's part of the same thing. Because my concern is if one passes and the other doesn't. I mean, I suppose if the overlay passes, the map passes and the bylaw itself doesn't, then it's moot. But if the bylaw passes and for whatever reason the map doesn't pass.
Which could happen,
Yes,
because,
absolutely.
yeah.
You need
If
to
it's
consider-
separate, right?
So is the map a separate article, or isn't it?
Well, that's the question. I
It's
don't
referenced in the
know.
bylaws. I think I was assuming that it was part of the bylaw change.
I would, my recommendation, not being town council, would be to have part of
Bylaw.
this being the establishment of the overlay, defining the overlay district within this article.
Right.
So that way it's all in one, and you can't get into that, because there's definitely, we dealt with this when we did the initial one, was kind of like, we had like 4 different plans based on like, if this passes, then we'll do this, if this doesn't pass, then we'll do this, and
Yeah.
but
And you'll see
there
the
could
the
definitely-
placeholder for like I think I called it the marijuana adult use overlay or something like that on there. And anywhere where you see the zoning, it would refer to that map instead of,
yeah,
the
But-
commercial industrial zoning kind of a thing.
yeah.
So we haven't fleshed it out yet, what that's gonna look like. So that's why it's probably not in its final form. It's kind of like a rough draft, but that's the intent, was to have it be part of the bylaw.
Yeah, because I think that makes sense, because there's definitely an aspect of NIMBYism in this.
All right, so where do they want to go?
Okay, so,
Give us the goods.
everywhere. You want to talk a bit about however you want to go.
So, I mean, I'll let you guys read through the bylaws, but for the most part, like, we kept the definition of marijuana establishments the same. It was a good general definition, and really just refers to the MGL and the Cannabis Commission definition of it, which is perfect. The zoning, the little chart that you guys had where it had industrial, commercial, that's where you see the little asterisk where we said overlay, so it's kind of a placeholder, so we're gonna replace where it says industrial, commercial, and put the overlay reference in there instead. And then the rest was replacement of basically what was before the registered medical dispensaries, and put more generic ones, because now we're covering all marijuana establishments, not specific to just medical dispensaries. So where we wanted to be more specific, because we're different than maybe the Cannabis Commission guidelines, or we wanted to reinforce something, or we didn't think that we would change something, even if the Cannabis Commission changed their guidelines, then we kind of specified a lot of the detail in that stuff. And then otherwise, I think there's a general statement that talks about the Cannabis Commission, all the different laws that kind of
Regulate.
that regulate this industry, right?
You seem to have a lot of very detailed definitions that seem to be a little, just on the flush, look like they're a little overkill. I'm not sure where they came from. Is this a typical bylaw you've taken from somewhere else? But it seems to go into a lot of detail with a lot of specific definitions that I don't know that we typically see in a normal bylaw.
Yeah, so some of the language that we got, we culled from, there was a general guidance document that was created based on, I think, a collaboration between a bunch of different community planning boards and maybe town managers. I'm not sure who else was involved, and they kind of came up with this model of what they thought would be good based on a bunch of different kinds of communities. And a lot of the language that we got kind of came from that.
So
Are
was the
all of these
plan-
definitions actually used in the bylaw itself, or are they just gratuitous definitions?
So the section 2.2 of our bylaws, I think, already has some definitions. This is just additional definitions in addition to what we already have in our section 2.2. The only definition that we added for marijuana specifically in 2.2 was the marijuana establishments. So these other ones were specific to marijuana, but they weren't defined already in our general bylaws. General
Denise, everything that's underlined is new language.
I don't know.
Let me pull it
That's
up.
like the track changes.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Marijuana
And then-
and testing laboratory?
The only thing we had literally before was literally just the RMD section, that was it.
Yeah. I
Certainly,
It's
think
like-
Orin's point is, do we use all these terms in the rest of the bylaw? So we've struggled with what's enough, what's too much. Are they, do we need all of them, or do we kind of
Do we
think
use
hit
them?
all
Yeah.
of them?
do we use them
Maybe in
in
the
what we're?
use table, or,
That's a good point, because I think as I was making changes to it, in the model that we had, they had, the zoning was specified by each specific type of marijuana establishment. We're not doing that in our example, so we could probably take some of that
so,
terminology out.
exactly, and I
Yeah.
think that's Orin's point. is
I think
that
you're right.
In one of the amendments we struggled with that we worked on last time, we had a flushed out lot of definitions, and we struggled with what do we include, what's too similar, are we using all these, would we use all these? So we want to strike that good balance between what we really need, what, kind of kind of had, what, like 4 or 5 on the table of who's been interested, you know, maybe we stick with those.
Yeah, what
You
I'll,
know, we're just kind of food for thought as you guys iron it out, because we
yeah,
gotta
what I'll
make
do,
sure we're using the
we
right
were
one.
scrambling the third rewrite on this. So what I'll do is I'll actually go through each of those words, and I'll do a word search to make sure it was used
Yeah, as
somewhere
long
else,
as
and
it's
if not, I'll
used,
take it
yeah.
out, yeah.
Yep.
Do you want to talk a bit about that model?
So where that came from was a Pioneer Valley planning district. It's like our Serpent, but in Pioneer Valley. So they had a whole bunch of planners, like Denise said, different people working on it, because they were asked to do so many different bylaw rights that they ended up doing this model bylaw that
Yeah.
they just put out on their website. So it's you know, a lot of different people and towns went into the process of coming up with language.
And the other thing too is the regulations from the CCC, they actually have some of well, I think they have all of them, right? Like, I just pulled it up real quick. It has marijuana retailer, marijuana transporter, product manufacturer, you know, things like that. So it, you know, we can always, again, just leverage back to the state requirements if we need it.
Yeah.
But it was in the I mean, it was nice when we were sitting there talking about, to actually be able to read some of these,
Yeah, yeah.
you know,
Yep.
and understand it, but totally understand your point of what's,
There was a lot of the
required,
bylaws that
necessary.
are already in accordance with the state regulations, but I felt like it would be too much probably to ask the voters to be able to have copies of the state regulations with them and a copy of the bylaws and flip between the two. So there's things that we thought that they would want to see and be most interested in, that we don't think would change a whole lot, even if the Cannabis Commission changes their guidelines, we kind of put that information in.
Yeah, really set definitions that aren't gonna change significantly over time.
Right.
Yeah.
and the model zoning bylaw, it is on the presentation on the reference materials in the appendix, there's a link to it
Okay.
under the researched items. So you'll see that, you can, in the electronic, did you send that to the group?
We forwarded everything. We forwarded your email.
No, but the presentation you just downloaded for me tonight,
Right, we didn't,
okay. Can you send that to them?
yeah.
Just so,
Right.
electronic copy, you could just click on it. I mean, I put like the actual URL, but they're quite
Type it
long.
out, yeah.
We're not gonna type that in.
It'll take a
Or we
while.
will try, but we'll probably type it in
zero or
quickly. Yeah, exactly. Is that an I, an L, a 1?
Good
No,
luck.
you got a backspace.
Renee, are you looking for comments from us today on parts of this, if we have them, or just in follow-up?
You know, again, input, feedback, can we talk a bit about where people are looking to go?
Yeah, let's
Yeah,
do it.
let's do it.
Okay.
You guys are, you're like,
I know,
putting us on the edge of our seats.
we want it to be like,
Go.
The big finale.
Right.
we want it to be interesting.
Before going there, could I just, a couple of things in some of the language and a question. On the very first page, Article 21, you make reference to in accordance with marijuana establishments, 105 CMR, blah, blah, blah. And then you have a comma, adult use of marijuana, 935 CMR. The zoning bylaw should be zoning act. 40A is zoning act. That's not a bylaw.
Oh.
It's a state law. And then, under definitions, you have, unless it's in the legislation, community host agreement as opposed to host community agreement.
Yeah,
that-
no, it should be host community agreement. and
Okay.
I had the same issue on a copy
And-
and paste.
Or, forgive me, I'm not familiar with the general law that defines host community agreement, but does the law define who negotiates that agreement?
It does,
You mean like what committee board?
Right.
I think it would have to vary, because some towns have mayors and
Well,
some boards.
but
Yeah.
the point in raising, or the reason for raising that point is, if you're gonna have that definition, I think it should define also who negotiates that. And I think it should be the Board of Selectmen, because otherwise you're gonna have the Board of Assessors, the planning.
Right,
A
right.
number of people are gonna vie for that authority.
I think they already have that according to the state.
Well, that's why I asked.
I think
don't-
they do too, but I can't recall specifically what it says, but most of them say like where a mayor doesn't exist, it's a select board or
That's been
town
brought up.
council.
That was discussed a few times from town council.
Yeah, I mean, if it's in the
I'll put a note.
regulations of the law, then fine, but if it's not, rather than worry about, in-house fight as to who's gonna negotiate this.
Plus, from an applicant perspective, it lets them know who's supposed to negotiate with them, and anybody else is just a shyster.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's defined. I mean, it's the first thing that they have to do. Like, you can't get a license from the CCC without a signed HCA,
Okay.
so.
Yeah.
And then, I find this curious, almost towards, the next to last page, special permit conditions. And I don't know what letter will be after all these strike-throughs, but right now it's E stricken through. Special permit shall lapse within 5 years of issuance. Do we have that now?
I think that's a current,
Is that is that this intended to be the special permit if not acted upon? Like, is that?
The
No,
host
it
community
sounded
is
like-
Required to be identified there?
I think that's in our existing bylaw.
That's
Just
that's
section.
why I'm asking, I haven't looked.
it is.
It's under our,
That's an existing
Yes.
bylaw, so, yeah,
Curious.
it's black lined on here, which means it was already an existing bylaw.
yeah.
Yeah, it's here.
Would we want a potential change to that?
Well, I'm thinking if I'm an applicant who's going to invest, some bucks, and typically a new business takes 5 years, that's kind of the standard model, that you hit your peak in 5 years. Just when you hit your peak, my permit for operations is gone. And whether someone is gonna wanna take that risk of, building up a business only to find out in 5 years, my permit's gone, or may potentially be gone. I don't recall a discussion around that originally.
There's a risk there anyway, because the host community agreement is only good for 5
5
years.
years, right? Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you go out of business. Again,
You just stop operating.
I
can't
wonder if
operate
it
without-
corresponds to like licensing terms as well. I don't know. Chris, would you happen to know that? Like, if applicants have to renew their cannabis license with the state every 5 years? Okay. I'll write a note,
Yeah, I
Joe, and
just-
we'll, yeah, no, it's a good point.
If I were an applicant, I'd be a little concerned about that, but if the HCA only lasts for 5 years, and the regulations must speak to what happens, perhaps the financial arrangement changes, but I can't imagine if someone goes out of business, if for some reason the select board doesn't want to renegotiate the HCA under the same terms. Anyway, just raise that as
So
a,
should we make it last for the length of the HCA?
Well, the HCA is 5 years.
Does it have like options to extend it? I don't remember.
You actually have something here on, I don't see the page number, but it says, permitted marijuana establishments shall file an annual written report and appear before the special permit granting authority no later than the January 31st of each calendar year, providing a copy of all current applicable state licenses for this facility and/or its owners, and demonstrate continued compliance with the conditions of the special permit.
We had a lot of
It's under
conversation on that
reporting
one.
requirements.
Huh?
It's under reporting requirements.
Yeah, annually, they're supposed to come before it, yeah.
Right. So that might get to your issue too, if they're already coming every year.
yeah, I've never seen anything where a license, I mean, typically a special permit runs with the land for eternity. It can't be, unless they violate the special permit, it can't be lost.
And this runs with the owner. So if the ownership changes, the new ownership needs to, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought I read
Well, I
that.
think they took that out. They took out F.
Would-
But anyway, but you do have the language in here that not recommends, but requires that applicants come back every year and provide the board with an update.
This makes sense.
Yeah, and some of the crossouts that you see at the end are only stricken because they're already covered elsewhere in the body of the bylaws. So they weren't necessarily all stricken because we didn't think they applied, they might be covered someplace else, so I didn't want to duplicate.
a lot of that too, like I'm reading this section, one of the sections Denise is talking about, talks about the permit holder shall provide to the building inspector and chief of police, names, telephone numbers, et cetera, of contact in the event that somebody needs to be contacted after business hours. Like that's coming from the CCC, and I think it's already above, like it's very repetitive. Like a lot of what we have is very repetitive.
And it does say here under E, issuance, transfer, discontinuance of use, special permit, site plan approval shall be issued to the marijuana establishment owner. And it's also a specific type of marijuana establishment, so I guess if the use changed,
Then they need a new permit.
need to come back.
And then further down there, under section 4 of E, it says, shall have a term limited to the duration of the applicant's ownership, control of the premises as a marijuana establishment shall lapse, expire if, and then it says, ceases operation for 365 days. The establishment's registration or license by the Cannabis Control Commission expires or is terminated and goes further on to. So that's a little bit different than the 5-year term that we're talking about earlier.
Seems redundant to have the 5-year term tacked on the end with all the other stuff that,
Well, I guess what's the intent of the 5-year on the special permit is to execute your special permit, to start your establishment?
it doesn't say that.
Yeah, but.
I don't know.
But what's the, I'm not
Something
saying
we
what
put
to say,
in,
what was the
so-
intent?
It goes back to the original
Article.
Meadow.
Yeah, it was just a
thing,
carryover
so,
from the original language. I wrote a note to strike it, so.
Yeah.
I think it just complicates the rest of the
Yeah.
language, so, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Move it.
I had
We haven't had a chance to review this in advance, so I'm not sure, I mean, I'm not-
No,
that's fine.
and that's fine, yeah, we're not looking for,
okay.
right.
Comprehensive.
There's a lot in there to cover.
Right. No, we'll be back. We'll be back because, I was gonna say, Scott, I mean, you read through it pretty quickly. You were like, oh, down here it says, I'm like, oh my God.
Oh, no, Joe's he's a fast reader, right?
Fast skimmer.
I have a couple of things, actually, I guess, if we're going to be into it. On page, let's see, 21.4,
We gotta get page numbers in here.
letter V, talking about the correlation to liquor stores in terms of a percentage.
So 20%.
Yeah.
I think, I guess, as long as we go into this with our eyes open, if we're pegging it to that number, we also have to consider the fact that there's a push to have a state ballot question to expand liquor sales to convenience stores. So if that number jumps, then the number that you're pegging it to jumps, and then you're,
So I think there's also.
as long as we
in there that
are
also
comfortable with
says-
both numbers, then we need to, then that's fine. But
Yeah, I think there's
just to-
also language at the end of that paragraph that talks about that just because you have the ability to have, let's say, 4 retail establishments, doesn't mean that the planning board is required to do.
No, I know,
Yeah.
but,
And that's one of our
So-
questions back to you too. So we were, one of our discussions at IDC was, do we say, hey, let's do 2 or 3, or do we say 20% or 30% so that when there's a change in population, right, it adjusts accordingly? But then we didn't know, does that put you in a situation where you don't want to have that determination and you want it to be stated, like Norton's not going to have more than this? And it's only, that's specific to the retail dispensary as well. Council in the HCA response, and I haven't sent this to you because I literally just got it today, she actually provided us with 2 separate sections on this particularly for the license. Do we want to do it by percentage or do we not? And 20% is what's there. I was actually, in our discussion, I was saying 30% because right now we have nine liquor licenses, and if we did 30%, we'd be in the 3, because we felt, I think we said 4 or 5 was too much. That's kind of what we felt, but then we felt like 2 maybe limiting. And-
Does this take us back to where you're planning on locating them?
Yep.
Yeah. They
Sorry,
really
I
wanna know
steered
the- They
over
really
you.
want to
They
know.
do.
yeah.
Let's do it like Jeopardy. So, I mean, it's pretty simple, right? So from a retail perspective, they want to be close to a highway, easily accessible, right, in and out. And I think that we agree with that. Like, we don't want something in the center of town where people have to travel down. We prefer get off the exit, go to the dispensary, get back on, and you're done. Or, like go around Alberto's, get something to eat, spend some more money in Norton. So a lot of our conversations with them have focused on 123, it's focused on 140, the exit there. I mean, certainly, I think 140 from everybody's perspective, because it's zoned commercially, I think every person that's come before us has said that area is like a prime spot for them up by the Xfinity Center.
So we're talking about this area?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, what other areas? Any other-
So off of 123, so by where the industrial park is, that's been a conversation as well. Yep, close to that. And then we've talked also on the tail end down by Bay Road, the other industrial area. So we've had applicants who have looked there, but of course, from a retail perspective, it's like, it's great now because people are going to come, but in 2 years, does it make sense for the business? Because in 2 years, when you have more of them, are people actually going to kind of travel off the beaten path? Now, take the alternate perspective from the distribution, transport, all of those folks are like, stick me in an industrial park, put me in a back corner. You know, they don't really want to be right off an exit. They don't care if they're traveling, you know, in the town or having to go to a different area. So we have some industrial areas, it's not Taunton, I always want to say Taunton, by Attleboro, that small section.
Yeah. You're
That-
talking about
Yeah,
like-
Old Colony,
Yeah.
Colony Road.
Yeah, is that,
Are you-
Granite Bedrock?
Yeah.
It's still,
down.
okay,
It's commercial.
Let's,
still 123.
mixture.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit of industrial, but, and so most of that, I mean, I can tell you, I think, and you guys please correct me if I'm wrong, I think everybody has said, if we open it up to some level of commercial, that certainly makes Norton more attractive.
Yeah, one of the biggest things we've heard consistently from not even just the marijuana people that have come to see us, but all businesses that we've spoken to so far, is the lack of space and areas and places to go. So the more we can kind of help to accommodate that, I think the better off that would be.
Are you talking about the industrial park off of 123? Or are you talking about this commercial strip center? Which is basically the front of Red Mill Village, and that's all there is maybe 4 stores, a little limited parking.
Kelly's
place
is?
So keep in mind,
That's what
we're
that
not
is.
looking at entire sections. Like, we're really going in very carefully into each of the zoning, like the commercial zone. It's not like we're picking the entire region, right? Because as we're starting to go through them, we're realizing some of them are actually in neighborhoods because of our crazy zoning. Like, you're going down a side street. Do we really want, you know, a retail shop on this side street that happens to be commercial? So we're not necessarily just picking up the entire, you know, red section of that area. We're really looking and seeing what specific part of that would make the most sense and would be the least, you know, impactful to residents.
Yeah, I'd say it's more parcel specific, not
Right.
necessarily all the zone.
Right. Well, the red on the map certainly helps us to focus. I mean, you know, perfect example, a lot of our discussion was in that section up by Xfinity Center. At the end of it, right, there's a row of houses on the street. And so Sandy was really good, and the maps, like she noted what was not a single home.
Or like a
Yeah.
my house.
Like a-
Residential,
Yeah,
yeah.
a residential house versus, you know, apartment complex or whatever it is, so that we would be able to make a more informed decision. So it is considering all of that, and that's one of the reasons why we didn't want to say, let's just open up commercial. You know, we looked at, there's a section on 140 that's commercial, and we talked about that at the meeting too, and then we're like, well, you know, does it make sense with things that are there now? I think there's gas station there, Mike's Pizza, a couple other things, and we're like, it doesn't really seem to fit the character, so, you know, that might be one that comes out completely. But you know, we're not completely through those discussions, so I don't know specifically how it's gonna come out, but that's part of it, and that's really what our focus is going to be tomorrow night, and hopefully it'll be defined tomorrow night, but it might be more meetings beyond then.
So I think that's what we're looking for tonight, though, right?
Right.
Is that we really have not agreed. We don't have a consensus yet. We talked about it the last meeting. Hopefully we'll get a lot more consensus tomorrow night. We've all kind of looked at it on our own in between. So we're looking to, you know, what are some of the criteria that you would like to see? Besides, obviously, we can't keep it from the other schools and those types of things. What are some of the other criteria that you'd like us to consider when we come up with the overlay?
And obviously, probably the focus is on commercial zoned areas that you want to include in the overlay zone. But also look at current industrial zoned areas that you don't want included in the overlay zone. You know, like what Oren's speaking to out in front of Red Mill Village, is that industrial?
That's commercial.
It's all
But
commercial.
there are industrial, you know, lots throughout the town that you probably don't want, you know, an establishment like this in. So you can exclude part of the industrial zoned areas as well.
Well, it depends. So again, we might not want a retail dispensary there, but could we have a 5,000, you know, foot building that's a grow facility, right? Because it is industrial. So and I think that's been our biggest struggle. It's like, you know, going back to that definition list to say, okay, like, how would these scenarios play out? if we took this, if we added it in, and it's tough. And like one of the questions that we had, and we're gonna have some additional conversation with Paul and Serped, just to, you know, help with some guidance of what others have done. Like, you know, we've talked about, maybe there's a potential where we have like, I think Dayton maybe has this, like a, it wasn't a retail overlay, but they had like a specific industrial overlay, and then they had another commercial overlay. You know, like having something separate versus an overlay.
Like where you can do retail, where you can
Right,
do.
right.
That's a good idea. Well, what I'm speaking about is like if you go down 123 towards Attleboro, on the right, or if you go down John Scott Boulevard, I think there's some industrial zoned areas that are kind of spotted along those areas, and I think a lot of them are within 500 feet of the.
Yeah, the
school.
one on 123 is completely within 500 feet.
So you could like exclude those
Yeah.
industrial areas from your overlay zone.
Mm-hmm.
You can exclude from industrial as well as start including some more commercial property. You know that, you can do the whole thing if you want. If you're gonna do an overlay zone and also do it right.
They're gonna find out tomorrow.
The front portion of the Leonard Street parcel is right now dedicated to retail use, but I would just note, one of the concerns that you may want to have, and I think we may have, is traffic. It's problematic as it's proposed now, and depending upon how, again, at this level of use, as we now see with marijuana dispensers, that's going to be a problem. If in fact that mitigates as you disperse more facilities, it becomes less of a problem, it may not be as bad. But that's a concern that I think I would have. I don't know, and you may want to just understand that.
No, I think it's a valid concern. I think, you know, you mentioned the appointments. That's why a lot of dispensaries have said by appointment only, so that they can control that traffic. You know, not sure that would be something that we would do, but it's certainly, you know, an
And I
option
don't
to
know that
discuss.
it works. I mean,
It's been
Right.
started
Could
that
serve
way,
as
and
kind of a soft open for the facility to get people who, okay, I went, I did it, hooray, and they may or may not come back now that they've
Tried it out.
done the new thing. And
Yeah.
maybe
And I
that's a
thought there are a lot
way
of towns that started that way
See
and then
this
found
line
it
in
really
Brookline
didn't
Village?
do.
It took me
Really
years to
didn't
figure
do
out what it was for. until
They lost a lot of.
The bank,
consumers that way, they didn't want to
Brookline
have
Savings
that
Bank, that line outside of what used to be
Gonna
Brookline
list.
Savings Bank? It's a marijuana
But
dispensary.
getting back to the overlay, and Renee, you talked about, I think, Dayton, but it might make sense to have some type of a tiered overlay that is more restrictive for retail. But if it's, you know, if it's either distribution or growth, does it really matter? And I'm looking at some of these industrial sites, and the one I'm most familiar with is on John Scott, not John Scott, but there is John Scott, but also South Worcester Street, the old Cisco. That whole area is industrial.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think we'd want a retail facility there, but do we
Right.
really care if there is a
Distribution house.
distribution or growth? So a tiered type of overlay would allow for that type of distinction.
To a point, I don't think a retailer would go way back there in the woods either,
No,
but.
and I use that as an example, but I suppose if
If you're attracting Taunton residents, they would.
Well, you gotta
You know where they
consider,
are.
They'd end up on Washington Street, though, if you're going there.
you have to consider the industry too, right? It's all startup mentality now, so it's all multimodal. 50 years from now, it most likely will have a distribution facility and retail only, just like liquor and cigarettes today. So if you make it too restrictive of these individual type of establishments and not multimodal, you won't be able to get startup groups in there today. No one will come in because like, well, I need to grow it and cultivate it and package it and sell it here in order to grow my business. Very few of them come in with enough money to be like, hey, I have my grow station down here, my retail over here. So you need to consider that startup mentality for the initial couple of years.
Yeah,
So among the
because it takes a while.
firms that are interested that you've
You're gonna get
spoken
bought out and
with,
sold.
how sensitive are they all to the community fee as well as the excise tax? Because they're two different 3 percentages, right? So they total, now do all establishments get charged with the excise tax regardless of the type of facility?
It's based on a municipality, so they all get charged the state. I think like one of the figures is like 10.25%, and then you can have the excise tax for the municipality, and then the community impact fee. Like it can add up. There's I don't remember where the breakdown is, but I can look for that. It's in either one of the guidance documents or the regulations. That talks.
Well, you mentioned the community impact fee of, that they were sensitive to anything more than 1%, one applicant.
No, so the 1% is the excise tax.
Okay.
So when you're talking about, like a manufacturer or a distribution center, they're not generating the same amount of revenue that a retail dispensary would. So to charge them 3% is a much bigger hit than it is for somebody who's, like with those dispensaries that open, like $1 million each in a week. So that was the difference is, be considerate to really what their business is, because if you make it too high, they're not going to want to do business with us.
Got it.
And we may decide not to do that at all.
But
Right,
they
to attract
both-
business
they're, you add them, you have a 3% excise plus the 3% community impact, so that's 6 plus whatever the state tax is, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
How sensitive are these folks that are coming to you to those fees?
We haven't talked about the community impact fee, but I can tell you from talking to people at the convention, I mean, it's standard, it's everywhere. I don't know many areas that aren't actually putting that in their HCA's. I can go through most of it. We haven't really looked at, we looked at the HCA's initially, but since we were waiting for town council to come back with a revision, we haven't looked at them.
Yeah, I don't think we've talked about
Recently.
dollars with most of these guys. Some of the retailers certainly were aware of the 3% retail amount, which they were, I think, were accustomed to, because I think everyone's doing this
Yeah.
at 3%. So they didn't seem opposed to that, but the excise tax, we haven't gotten into with any of these that I can recall.
That would also be impacted by the number of licenses you allow. In other words, if, for example, you only allowed one, then I'd be willing to pay a higher excise fee if I have no competition in town, as opposed to 10. I don't want to pay 3%
Yeah.
if I'm competing against 9 other. So those two things are related, I think.
Yeah, we've had some discussion on too, like how are we viewed as a community, as a town, if we have, 2 licenses versus 5? And we kind of went back and forth. I think it was more assumptions, and we need to be more specific when we have these conversations, just
If
to,
you're only really looking at 2 areas, I mean, I just don't envision having multiple stores that close together.
Right.
I mean, how many stores can you fit on a
Right.
block? I mean,
Well, and they also have to,
and
How many
then
Dunkin'
you-
Donuts do we have? I mean,
yeah, they have to be 500 feet away from each other as well.
Well-
But, I mean, we were looking at 3 exits, right? We still have, I mean, the industrial park off of Bay Road, it's not that far off. I mean, it's really not that far either. Now, if they were tucked back in there, depending upon what property was available, it could be a different story. But, I mean, those are things that they have to decide, right? We can say, look, this is what's available, and they need to determine what's the best business model for them.
Where I was going with the fees is obviously we're having this discussion because of the revenue that they potentially bring to the town. So that if you're in a position where you have to negotiate the fees down, either one of the 2 fees, then, the benefit of entertaining any of these companies is diminished. So the closer, the more you negotiate down to a 0, the less attractive any of the firms look to the town, because we're really doing this for the revenue, let's face it. Right, if we were getting 0, tax revenue, we'd probably be looking at other type businesses, I'm guessing. I mean, what's the benefit?
So the one thing that we have noticed, so, we've had some other conversations with folks about coming into town, and a couple of the hindrances have been the sewer or water tie-ins, things like that. When we've asked these groups those specific questions, they're not dependent on that. So for them, the fact that we don't have the infrastructure to really promote economic development the way we would want, it's a non-issue. So that's a benefit in having this type of an industry here.
And getting back to the number, I would suggest rather than do it as a percentage of liquor licenses, I mean, the liquor license ratio is based on population. So you may want to just, skip the middleman in terms of the liquor licenses and go based on population.
Number.
I'm not sure what the number should be, 1 for every 10,000 or portion. I mean, we're at, 19,000 people?
Just skip the middle ratio.
And just say, one retail license for every 10,000 or 7,500, or any portion. If you hit 20,001, you get we have a 3rd license. But
Yeah, like-
that way you don't have to deal with, any changes in the liquor license ratios that the state may impose.
Okay.
And that gets to your point too, Tim, about the state ballot and what could potentially happen to that. If it's just straight out population, Joe, that's a good
But
suggestion.
that's what the liquor licenses are
Right,
based on anyway.
yeah.
It's probably something like just simple math.
Yeah.
Liquor license for every 2,000 residents right now is probably close to where the liquor license falls, right?
I think it's.
Because we have 9 of them?
Full
you
liquor
know?
We have
license.
9 and, yeah, we.
Every
we're about
5,000, I
19,000.
believe, you're entitled to one license, minimum of 3.
How many? 5,000?
Every it's been a while since, I think it's every 5,000. And then beer and wine is some other ratio. It's in chapter 138. I just don't remember what they are, but I thought it was every 5,000 for full liquor, and then beer and wine something else.
Yeah,
Norton,
all I know is that we
we
have
have,
9 right now with a population of 19,000, that's all. I don't know how the breakdown is. We can,
Norton has an extra one because of a special act.
it's a good idea. I'll,
Just one.
The Fernandez Act?
What's that?
The supermarket used to have one?
No, it's actually the produce barn. That liquor license is
Oh, okay.
is exempt from the population.
Yeah.
Interesting.
why is that? Because they did a great concept of hardware, grocery store, and liquor all in
Yeah,
one?
the one-stop.
One-stop shop.
You need a beer for the frustration when you can't get the drink.
And when you see the grocery
Rent the
bill.
U-Haul.
Yeah. And then you decide, I'm grilling out tonight, right? While you're there.
That's funny.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, hey, Paul, you mentioned the village center zoning. We had that as a question, like, is there anything in what you guys are contemplating that we need to consider or just be aware of?
Of
Well,
rezoning
we were
areas.
initially proposing no for marijuana
Okay.
establishments there. But again, this is all up for discussion with this committee and then as it goes publicly, but
And do we know where those areas are? And I only ask because our conversations have like brought us down 140 into Commercial Village.
So one of them's up
It's
by
a
the Attleboro
village
side,
commercial.
right?
I'm
He just
backwards.
mentioned like
Yeah.
by where the marble place is, that's village commercial, correct?
right, so the village where we're looking to apply initially, the village center, village core district is essentially from the 123, 140 intersection over toward Yale, the Yale Elementary School.
Down west?
Yeah, west.
I thought that
And it
was-
really, it goes
Okay.
down south a little ways, but that's all Wheaton property.
So,
I
but,
think it stops before the area you mentioned in terms of Mike's Pizza.
Yeah,
I put
oh, it doesn't
So
go down that far.
it doesn't go down that far.
It basically mirrors the village commercial zoning in that area, so Mike's Pizza's much farther down than this.
Okay, and you call that village core? Is that the terminology you're using?
Village Center Core zoning district.
so my understanding is the village center core, the concept is to be, the idea ideally would be, it's like a walking area where people can kind of walk around the area, right? So what would the village center, the part that's way out in the Attleboro area, how does that fit? Like, what's the intent behind that zoning?
That's
The
unchanged.
village commercial.
Village commercial, sorry, yeah.
Well, that's been applied, that's been out, for quite a few years. And one of the reasons we wanted to apply a new district here was that the village commercial district is it's very broadly applied, very different places has the same district on it. So when we were looking at the area around the village green, we felt that this was the more historic area, it was a different place than, say, down at the Attleboro line, so it should have different standards.
Right.
I think at some point we should be looking at that area and to see if the current zoning works there, if we can do something different.
Like, I guess my question is, that area, why is it village commercial versus just commercial?
I
You
don't
don't
know
know?
why it would have.
I don't know.
It's kind of like asking why we have houses.
It might
Talking
be,
about in the Attleboro,
Our zoning doesn't need.
I think that is just commercial.
Yeah, in general, like,
that's
what
been our
makes a village
conversation.
one by
commercial?
Attleboro is just commercial. It's not village commercial.
Well, how about the area up in, that we just changed from commercial to village commercial up on 140?
That's all residential.
That's residential.
that was all
in nature.
residential.
Yeah.
But that's
one
where
of-
like Produce Barn is and
No,
all those.
it's,
That's
no,
all
it's north
commercial.
of there. It's Smith Street, that area around.
The word
Mansfield
changed.
Is that what you
That's
just changed
all-
to commercial?
Village
No, we changed
commercial.
it to village commercial.
From commercial.
From commercial.
So the zoning's wrong? Because Smith Street has it as commercial?
We have to still change, well, we have to update all the maps,
Okay,
so.
okay.
But it's been changed at town.
But further
last town
down
meeting.
where you have.
That was in October, recent.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because that was a big focus of our
Right, but
conversation.
further down where you have, Produce Barn, that area, right now on the map, it's showing as village commercial.
Where the
I believe it
produce
is.
store-
It
I need
goes
to
from
see
the
the
I
red-
believe
Here,
that
I
is.
have it.
Yeah,
Okay.
we
That
changed
was
that.
That was
And that was changed a couple of years ago.
ago?
Yeah.
A couple of years
So
ago.
what was I guess my question is, what's the rationale in changing it to village commercial? What advantage did that give to you?
So we had a
What did
big
that-
discussion around avoiding spot zoning. We had a lot of freckle zoning all over the place.
You're talking about,
And I remember your predecessor, Paul, was really focused
No,
on
that's-
that.
Sorry, here, no.
Avoiding rezoning areas that were gonna create spot zoning and
Right.
trying to consolidate
This one's
multiple zones that
Thank you.
kind of intertwine,
this one's
clean
showing
it all up and
already,
streamline it
right
all.
here.
So I think that, where they're referring to
Piece local.
up near the Porter's barn was to clean up some of the spot zoning. Does that make
Yes.
sense?
When it
Yeah.
was brought before town meeting, it was the applicant the landowner wanted.
That's Smith
the change.
Street, that's different. I'm talking a couple of years
No,
ago.
the applicant wanted it. That's how it was brought forth at town meeting.
Okay.
Because I wasn't on this board then, I was just sitting in the meeting.
And that area has a mixture of commercial and residential uses.
Right.
So village commercial allows
Multi-use.
Right.
multiple uses and reducing the non-conforming.
Well, that's what I was just gonna say, right? I mean, where these changes have been made, I think were to reduce the nonconformances
Yeah.
in that zone. Because if you're commercial, but there be housing all along that's a nonconformance use. So then if you go to propose a change on that property, it's flagged as that. So I think a lot of those changes is to try to make it so that the zone actually matches what is in that area, which village commercial then allows you to have residential and commercial all within one kind of larger conforming use within the zoning code. And that
So
was
there
part
aren't
of
supposed
the
to be
argument.
residential in the commercial, is that the idea?
If it's zone commercial, you're not, yeah, residential is non-conforming.
So, okay, so that we have all of these lots that are in there that are residential that shouldn't be.
We have
Well, they're
existing non-conforming lots
non-conforming.
all over town.
Pre-existing.
right,
They're
and
legal.
that's been our conversation is, like, we can't just find everything that's red on here because we know that.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's kind of like the Reed and Barton, right? It's industrial. Like, I'd never, like, have a retail place go right there. I mean,
Yeah, 'cause it's surrounded by residential.
right,
lots.
right. So that's been a big struggle, but I think it's funny that
That's the area.
that is the part that we were talking about. I had another
So we voted on that in October to change that, is that what you're saying?
Well, just.
That was just,
That was the Smith
there was a,
Right.
str-
yeah.
there was
Yeah.
a small, I don't know, probably
So if I go back
12
to
to
that
15
town meeting, I can
lots
find that?
on, by Smith Street.
It's
That
just a
was,
Smith
they were all
The
residential
loop
homes.
right up there, Sandy.
Okay.
Where it's
Yeah.
all,
It was
Yeah.
all
all homes.
south
That easier.
of the bank.
Yeah, south of the bank.
What year this is from?
Yeah, south of the bank and north of Emma's.
Emma's, yep.
So this was rezoned. I gotta just throw this one out.
I have it.
That's the latest.
I'm
I
having
know for
version
sure.
control issues.
Okay.
All right, that's good feedback.
How do you guys feel, if I can ask just quickly, one of the items, and I think we touched on this, but the language of the special permit, like based on character of the town, like, what are you looking for from a scale of being restricted versus like having the autonomy to decide if a permit should be approved? Like, how, I mean, I know that you'll give us feedback when we, you know, when we present you with that, but is there something, like some sort of language that you typically adhere to that Denise can put in there?
I think it's not only the character of the town, but the character of the neighborhood.
Right, it's more focused on, yeah.
So yeah, preserving the character of the surrounding area,
Yeah.
which you guys have in there.
In my opinion, the special permitting process puts a lot of weight on the abutters and the people that'll be directly impacted, you know, right? I mean, so that's why it's important to have a special permit versus, you know, yes, for example. At least you have that vetting process and you allow the public to come and voice their concerns and such and modify the plans accordingly and that kind of thing. You can't put that then into the language as part of the special permitting process, so, you know.
Okay. If we think about next steps, I know, Julie, you were telling me you guys formed a subcommittee.
For the village core commercial, we've got a subcommittee.
How would you anticipate or expect, like, our engagement with the board as we, like, come up with an actual overlay and make some more modifications?
because we set that up, was that specific to just this one, Paul, or is it to help with anything that comes up? Did,
No.
kind of when you were envisioning it, did you
I was kind of
tell Orin and
envisioning.
Scott and I what we really signed up for?
It was-
And we're gonna find out. Alan
It's
will be
certainly
here
up to,
too.
it's certainly up to the board if they want, you know, up to establish a permanent subcommittee that looks at zoning bylaw changes that would come before. I mean, the challenge is, of course, we get applications, as you know, right at the deadline that
Yeah.
come from residents, but if it's town initiated, my thought was anything that, you know, down the road that we're initiating here, that we would have to have it done in time for the subcommittee to meet. But there are communities that have zoning bylaw subcommittees that look at these changes on a regular basis, so. So you, it's up to you. I just thought this would be in responding to comments that you all made after the last town meeting, to
Yeah.
get these to you as soon as possible. I think the subcommittee is a very good opportunity to introduce it.
It just makes it hard to do it with a full committee, if there's other things going on, working on other, you know, projects and permits. It's just hard to
Right.
go in depth and to go, walk line by
To do
line,
what
and
we've
why
done
is this
tonight.
here? And we
Yeah.
need some research before you can answer it. And it's very difficult to work through a document that's, you know, something this tight.
Right.
At a meeting.
Right.
So whether it's this committee or we generate another committee, I don't care, but I think that might be the most fruitful way of moving it forward faster. And then certainly, at any meeting, we should have a slot where we can have an update. And so if we're running across issues that we want to bring to everybody before we take too far down the road, we can say, this is an issue we're
Right.
talking about
That's-
now. How does the, you know, how
That's
does the
why we
the
set
planning
it up
board
this
feel about
way,
it, then we
to
take it back.
get the issues out there early.
Yeah.
So that's why, you know, in the next meeting here, January 28th, you know, it's my hope that we will have the first draft of the new commercial district to the board. And again, it's my hope that the board will transmit the language that becomes the warrant article on February 12th. It's the goal.
I mean, I think the process this committee is doing is really helpful, and I just always get concerned, I'm starting to see the clock tick, and we talked about this committee coming up with some proposals, that's been vetting it within other committees within the town, and maybe even vetting it with some of the business owners in this district. I mean, I think, and I'm looking at this timetable, and I'm already feeling the crunch of February, we have to a warrant on this, and it's hard to do that, and I don't know, it's important to do it, but I don't know that the process should overwhelm the purpose. And if the purpose, I mean, there's a need and a purpose, I think yours is maybe even a little bit more focused than the Village Core Center in that it's not.
No, Warren, I'm
I don't
going to
know.
disagree with that.
Okay, but I'm just saying.
We're going to have that conversation, but I think we'll have a
getting-
chance to
but-
fully explain that. I don't think the village core is a very difficult concept to get to, so.
Well, but do you want to get people fed into that and get consensus within the community, or do we want to have 120 people stand up and say, vote yes or no on a project?
Well, remember the milestones I've given you? We're planning on going out to meet with the business owners, the property owners, as well as meetings with the abutters.
And I agree.
Before it
I'm
goes.
just-
So we're doing exactly what you're saying there.
Okay, I'm just suggesting that the timetable starts to get tight when you look at all of that.
It does, but that's what we're stuck with. I mean, I can't initiate something, it's difficult to initiate certain things a year beforehand. But, you know, I'm working with what we have, you know, putting it out there 5 months before it goes to town meeting. But as a board, you have the authority on any of these, especially with something that we initiate. If you say it's not ready, we pull the plug on it. I hope you look closely at it and, you know, if that's the decision, it's very well thought out, because a lot of work has been put in and we've spent money on that. So, on the village center, that was part of the deliverables for the village center plan, so.
Well, I mean, I think the subcommittee is a great first start in us starting to kind of rework through that process. And, you know, I think what you ladies have done is, you know, I think thinking about the same things that we're doing is, you know, putting it out there early, starting to take a look at it. And I think, you know, we're all collectively working in that same direction, which is good. So, we can talk on Thursday. Personally, myself, if this subcommittee works, and, I'm game for sticking with it and continuing on, not to speak for Orin and Scott or Alan, but, if we find that this process is working, that we feel like we're digesting things, we're getting things to this board, we're getting things out to the stakeholders within the larger population, then, I'm hopeful that it will work the way that we're kind of starting to lay it out to do that, so that we could take on things like this and others that are gonna pop up, go back to some of our other definition issues, and some of the other things that we've had a harder time on, and really kind of flush them out, so.
How is your committee working? Is it, like your next step? You work within a committee? Do you have a subcommittee working on a particular bylaws, or?
It's really the main focus of the IDC right now is focusing on just this.
Okay.
How many members do you guys have?
5 and
Five.
1 alternate right now, and 1 vacant alternate.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think from my
And one
perspective,
active alternate?
I guess from my perspective, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I feel like we have a lot to kind of look at. I know I haven't been able to read through all this all that deeply, but I guess get feedback be best funneled. How? I guess how would you like to get our feedback, A? And B, maybe it makes sense looking at your timeline for you to touch base with our subcommittee via Paul on kind of March 1, based on kind of your timeline here, which is kind of like a little before March 1.
I think we'd want to engage a little bit earlier than that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess.
Because I think that's more final, like we want to be in a good position where you guys are comfortable.
So maybe we just start, this Thursday is the subcommittee's first session, so maybe we start there, set some ground rules, and then Paul maybe can circle back with one of you to
Sure.
establish what the next step is.
Okay.
Whether we fit it into the same process or set up something else, maybe that's the best way.
Yeah.
Because
I already
a
have some
few of us are sitting here
takeaways
saying,
here.
we have a subcommittee,
Yeah.
but we don't know the
Well, we haven't met yet,
effectiveness. We don't
so
know-
we're gonna see what happens.
We may jump into that and go, wow, there's a lot here to deal with, maybe not, and this could be easily absorbed into it. So maybe we
Yeah.
just start there, let Thursday come and go, and then Paul can communicate the success of that, or.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I guess if there are people who are watching this at home and they want to reach out to you, how should they do that?
They can email or call me. We have, so out on the website, the IDC, all the members are there with their email addresses. So they can certainly email the group or email myself or Denise.
Yeah, and forgive me, I don't know. Do businesses typically reach out to your committee to get a sense of opportunities within the town, or do you reach out to them? So in our reviewing of, the village core, obviously we're looking for a subset of businesses. Are those people that tend to come to you, that you'd have a sense of who's looking to come into this kind of community, or what they're looking to do?
I know you were about to talk, so I'll let you.
Well, I was just going to say that most of the time they come to us via either Mike Units, or we have the benefit now of having Select Board Member Deli here, so she's able to get her information from the board level and bring it to the IDC. So for the most part, it comes to us from somebody else in the town.
It's actually one of the things that we've kind of put on hold, because we've talked about how do we, do certain things within the IDC, like having a business guide, doing more outreach and networking. But, like to Denise's point, I mean, we've kind of, while all those things are in play, we're putting a pause on that just because of the timeframe for the town meeting. And it's hard because we don't, it wasn't until, 2 weeks ago that we actually voted for when that town meeting would be. So, you have a 3-month period, you just don't know, is it going to be in the beginning or the end?
Yeah.
And getting all the housekeeping done, I think will give you a nice baseline to then have some intake campaigns and stuff.
Yeah, and I think we've had a lot more discussion than we probably anticipated going
Yeah,
into this.
yeah. Debate.
That's not a bad thing.
Debate.
Yeah, that's not a bad thing.
It is,
No, it's
it
not.
was healthy discussion, but
Yeah.
it literally was 4 hours of, how do we want this overlay to look? And,
Yeah.
Smith Street was one of the ones we were stuck on for a while, so it's, like, now that we know too, that the map online isn't entirely up to date, like, that's gonna help us, because we can come back and say, look, this doesn't feel right. Like, that was when we're like, it just doesn't feel right, like it should be commercial. But then others like, well, it's commercial, like, you know that it's commercial, you get these, whatever, these benefits you can sell for more, but, so that was our discussion. But Sandy did a really nice job of, like, creating areas in the town, like pockets where we can focus on one area, have discussion on it, and then, we kind of come up with some criteria ourselves. So our hope is that we have like a good set of, these are kind of like the 5 considerations that we've looked at, and now this is your visual map that you have in front of you. And then you can pick it apart and tell us where,
First draft's always the hardest, right?
yeah.
I was trying to come up
Take all the fire.
with those criteria that aren't arbitrary, right? Why are we taking this piece out, but we're including this piece? To me, it should be consistent. It should be something, we have a rule that we're kind of applying across the board. So that's been my kind of big focus.
So Paul, for the online maps, aside for the changes that happened in the last town meeting, is there another queue of updates that's pending, or are they up to date other than that?
Those are it, but we don't, we have to work with Serpent to update the maps, so.
But that's the only zoning change we've made, right? Just at Smith Street?
Right,
Yeah,
since
so that's the only thing that would
digital-
be
So taking that
incorrect
with some of
on your
the
version.
So of
content
course
from
it's the
town
first
meeting,
one that
so
we looked
correlated.
Yeah.
And could there be errors on the map?
Sorry.
Sure.
Sorry.
And I can tell you, the last hand-drawn map had problems with it too, so it's iterative, but
Okay.
yeah, part of the things we're working with Serpent, we have to work with them to do those things until we can get a GIS program going.
You don't remember the legacy attorney that stood up for the neighbors on Smith Street and talked for a half hour at the town meeting in October? That kind of, you forgot?
I don't know. I don't remember it being. I guess I didn't know where that street was when the person was talking, and now all of a sudden,
Yeah.
like we're studying the maps and we
Yeah.
know where every street is.
I mean, we're doing drive-bys, right? Because we're like, well, you can only tell so much from an aerial view or
Yeah.
this color, so. And a couple of times there are houses right on that area that it's up by the bank or the other, I don't know if that's a retirement community there. Like, there are 2 houses, and I see it on what she noted, but I've been past her 3 times, I'm like, where are these houses? So I don't know if they're set back and I'm just not seeing them, or,
Yeah.
they're small, and, so it's interesting, because trying to like bring it all to life is very
But
difficult.
what's good for you is to collect all of the interested parties that want to either marijuana, on a facility or any type of a business, to try to keep track of where they're looking and where they're interested in. Like with the sewer connectivity, maybe there are more people interested in 123 now than before, or, small retail establishments may be interested in, the village commercial in the future. But as people come in, try to plot that, or at least write down the addresses so that, you can revert back to it later.
Yeah.
And it's probably gonna be very helpful when you develop this overlay district based on the 5 or 6 people that have come in and spoken with you already. Because where 6 potential marijuana companies want to locate, it's probably not gonna be much different than if you polled 20 of them, right?
Right.
Because they're all interested in the same proximity and location and, access to the highway and such. So I'm sure that's gonna feed into your proposed overlay zone.
Yeah, exactly.
So in the meantime, I do have some takeaways from some of the notes that you guys already mentioned on the bylaw stuff, and I'll make sure to implement those. I guess if you have any changes when you go through it, should we have them filter that back to us, or?
Do you typically filter it through you? Or do you guys you're gonna decide at the subcommittee?
Is that the subcommittee discussion?
I don't know if
Oh,
that's
yeah, sorry.
subcommittee for the entire board.
We just worked out the time we were meeting.
I know. So why don't we,
3 of us got roped into it at our last meeting, and Alan's in it, so, no, I'm kidding.
I think we
Well,
can
that's
consider
what we're
whether
trying
we
to-
have
that's what
capacity
we're
to
trying to
fit
figure
this in
out.
there,
Okay,
maybe.
gotcha.
So why don't we just say, if you read it and something really stands out, I mean, I'm fine if you want to email me directly, and I'll bring it back to the IDC, or if you want to filter it so you're just aware of, I mean, you tell me, I don't know your process.
It
but-
should probably just go through me, and I'll make sure
Okay.
that you get it.
My apologies, I misunderstood. I thought that your meeting was about village commercial. I didn't realize
It is.
broadening to,
Well, so we decided to start this, subcommittee, so Scott Oren and I volunteered to be on it with Alan from zoning, and we're meeting Thursday for the first time. It started off as just the village commercial, so I think we'll see how that dialogue goes. If we think we can kind of take this on as well, then, we can dialogue around that. If not, then we'll, I think make a decision on that, but I think kind of maybe even potentially, separate from that, if anybody on the board has strong opinions about something that's written, Paul, we could, funnel it through you, since this presentation was to the entire board.
Right.
I don't want to stop comments because, we're gonna kind of organize ourselves on Thursday. I think Joe had some great comments already, and I think if anybody else, if that's okay with you, Paul, we can funnel those through. And then if we
Perfect.
really think we've got time and can take a hard look at it and really dive into it with you guys, and we'll know that once we kind of, I think, set our eyes on our goals
Is there a
here.
Word version of this that we might be able to get
Yeah,
access to?
you should have it already. That should have been sent this afternoon.
Okay.
It was.
It's in
So
there.
the article itself, will the IDC be the sponsor of the article at the town meeting, and we will just vote on it and report on our vote, or are we the sponsor?
Or the Board
I'm
of Selectmen
thinking the
will
IDC
sponsor.
should be the sponsor, to be honest with
Yeah.
you, because it's kind of.
So it would be the Board of Selectmen then, because we operate under the board.
Okay. I think you can still be the sponsor, though, like even an individual can be a sponsor. Like the Smith Street rezoning, that was
Yeah.
sponsored by the individual, right, the attorney?
But that was a petition,
It
wasn't
was
it?
a petitioned
It was a
article.
petitioned
yeah.
article, yeah.
But I
And we'll
think
figure
that
that out. I mean, we
Yeah.
can look to see how,
Because it may actually
counsel.
carry more
Yeah.
Yeah.
substantive support if the IDC is sponsoring it. That's my thought. If people at the town meeting realize we're doing this to increase, tax revenue, then,
Especially if it's coming up at the same time as the village core amendments are coming up.
mm,
Makes more sense coming.
Yeah, maybe pass it by town
So-
council, see if we can prevent it from the IDC.
yeah. I mean, I don't care either way. Like, my thing is that you guys are on board, that, we have some consensus about our approach and we're doing the right thing for the town.
and we'll vote on it, and then we'll give a report
Sure.
to the town meeting on how we voted in support of it. But then it would be up to somebody on your group to present it to the town meeting,
Sure.
if you go that route.
Okay.
I think Kevin's got a good point. We'll definitely have more of a business focus,
Mm.
which I think could be well received.
Plus, you'll probably do a better job explaining it than us. Speaking for myself.
Okay. Is there anything else that we wanted to talk to them about? We can let them all get going.
Great. Thank you guys so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
I'll race you home. I love that dog of yours.
Oh, he's a big.
How old is he?
8.5.
He looks like he's aging, but he's still active, runs around.
His face is all white now.
Oh, really?
Paul, I know you had at least one other note that you wanted to pass along to the board, so I'll let you kind of take that before somebody gets eager to.
Adjourn?
Yes.
Oh, I don't mind if someone wants to. Just quickly, good news, we ended up getting an award, $100,000 for an assessment grant from Mass Development for Reed and Barton. So we will soon begin putting more test wells into the soils to see what is or isn't down there. So I think that's good news. We also have 2 other grant applications out for about $900,000 for additional assessment funds and for demolition of the remaining buildings. So
Oh, all at Reed and Barton, Paul?
all for Reed and Barton, right. So we won't know about those until February, March. But we've got the 100,000, so we've got our work ahead.
Maybe the building committee will put that property back on their list.
Well, I should point out that,
Now that a certain member is no longer on the committee.
well, we promised them that this would be used for private development now. So that actually makes a difference in terms of a lot of grant applications because so many of them are tied to economic development, so.
Oh, okay.
So we'll be initiating that. We'll be working on, providing an updated scope and signing a contract with Mass Development, so.
So if it was going to be a municipal property, then we would have not gotten the grant, basically.
We were able to get it, we don't own it, but because we have legal access to the site. So earlier this year, Chris went to the, I I guess the land court, I think the land court, maybe Superior Court, and we were granted what they call an administrative warrant, which gives us all sorts of, a limited amount of rights to enter the property, but conduct assessment, cleanup, demolition work as well. So we provided that with all of the applications, so that helped. But we don't own it. But if that changes, we'll let you know.
Okay. Okay. Is there any other comments or anything anybody else wanted to share with the rest of the board?
No, I just had a question. There was something posted on the website about the construction, the sewer line. Was that only just for a couple of days, running from Washington Street for the,
The rerouting,
yeah, was that?
I don't know how long that's going to be, but they've now shifted, and they're, approaching the freeway, so, but I don't know what the schedule is for how long they'll be out there.
Okay.
Was that what you were?
Yeah, that's what I was talking
Yeah.
about, because it just said the first and second, or second and third, and it didn't say when it started, didn't say how long it was projected to be or what was happening, so.
They probably have to leave it vague because of weather.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a 2 week, a 1 week, a 6 month.
It took a couple, when they were over here, they had closed the road to only local traffic for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks.
Well, this was routing it down Plain Street, down to Burke Street and all the way around. Are they still doing? is
Yeah,
that
they're still doing that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
They were rerouting people up Pine to Plain and back, so, or
Yeah.
back onto 123.
Yeah. I mean, just based on where you can see them have like cut the pavement or repaved it, Orin, they're probably about like halfway now up from Washington, like headed towards 495. So, I mean, they've been at it for 3 days maybe since that detour was in place. So I assume we're looking probably at another week or so, depending on weather and
Okay.
potential snow tonight, I'm sure. So.
Okay.
Only because I see the detour every day going to drop my son off at school. And I'm like, okay, I gotta figure out how I'm getting to 495 to get to work.
Okay.
So it's been out there for a few days.
Nobody has anything else? I'll entertain.
So we have Cumberland Farms, and is that other project coming back on the
Yeah.
28th? Okay.
Yeah, so you'll have,
The housing.
right, Wading River Estates.
Oh, that's it.
Then, again, we'll see what.
South Worcester Street, yeah.
South Worcester, right.
Okay.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn. Second.
All in favor?
All right.
Aye.
We are adjourned.